Jeffrey, thank you so much for being with us again. Your contribution is always invaluable when it comes to explaining all the details of the technical and political details of the situation around Ukraine. I would like to start with the latest. Three Russian soldiers were killed or wounded during the drone strikes on the military bases in Russia, two oblasts, Ryazan and Saratov. And then on Tuesday, apparently there is one more drone strike in Kursk. Ukraine appears to expose Russian air defense gaps with long-range strikes. This is the statement that Reuters made just today on the headline. How do you think this is raising stakes in the war?
Well, I think it brings home to the Russian leadership that their target, that Ukrainians are more than willing to go after legitimate military targets in Russia, and that Russia shouldn't think that it can execute this war without repercussions. And as Russia can't just exercise this war in Ukraine and not expect things to actually happen inside of Russia.
Jeff, we know that Washington warned Ukrainian leadership against using U.S. supplied arms for striking Russia inside the Russian territory. What's going on with that?
Well, there's a difference between using U.S. systems to strike targets in Russia and the Ukrainians, just of their own ingenuity, using systems of their own design or their own inventory to strike targets in Russia. So I think those are two very different things. I think that the U.S. is rightfully concerned about escalation and playing into the narrative that this is a U.S.-Russia war, not a Ukraine-Russia war, but it's very much a war between Russia and Ukraine. And Ukraine, it's legitimate for Ukraine to strike targets in Russia, especially military targets.
Wall Street Journal reported that U.S. modified HIMARS systems before handing them over to Ukraine for the purpose of exactly these systems not being able to reach targets in Russia. What are the reasons for Washington to exercise such caution? Is there a lack of trust somewhat, or why all this effort is being underway?
I don't know if it's a lack of trust. I think that if it's true, it would be that the United States wants to help Ukrainians fight Russians in Ukraine and doesn't want this to escalate. Is trying to manage escalation in such a way that Russia doesn't have an excuse to try to turn this into a larger conflict.
Yeah, Ukrainian government so far declined to publicly acknowledge its involvement in the latest drone strikes on Russia. And the New York Times writes it's keeping with its practice with other attacks on Russia and Russian-occupied Crimea. Why do you think Kiev is choosing to stick to this practice of not acknowledging the strikes?
I think it's an interesting tactic of maintaining some kind of ambiguity there, even though it's hard to imagine anybody else conducting these strikes. And so I think it has more to do with kind of an implicit signal to Moscow that targets in Russia are completely legitimate, but at the same time, it doesn't give Moscow the hook to blame Ukrainians for something, right? Even though that would be absurd. We've seen Russians before. We've seen the Russian leadership, and Putin in particular, get really mad because the Ukrainians strike something in either Crimea or Russia. And this kind of leaves a little bit of ambiguity, even though everybody in the room knows that the Ukrainians are capable and willing to strike military targets in Russia.
Last week, the Ukrainian side announced that it lost about 10 to 13,000 troops in the battle, emphasizing that Russia lost about 7 times more. Does this count sound plausible to you? Because General Mark Milley recently suggested that both sides might have lost about 100,000 soldiers each.
Yeah, I think it's very hard to tell the numbers. I mean, I imagine it's hard even on both sides for the Russians and the Ukrainians to understand the numbers. It depends on how you count them. Is the 100,000, is that casualties? Of those 100,000, how many have returned to duty? How many can't return to duty? How many are dead? But I think the bottom line is that both sides have lost tremendous numbers of people. If I had to guess, I would think that perhaps the Russians lost more because they lost so many in the beginning. But that's not to take away from the fact that the Ukrainians have also lost a tremendous number of people, whether that's permanently like dead or casualties or wounded, what have you.
So how open do you think the sides are about reporting these losses?
I'm sorry, could you say that again?
How open are the sides about reporting these losses? For instance, there were a number of analysts here on this show suggesting that Washington doesn't exactly know what the losses are because there is no reporting
Right.
from the
No, it's very
Ukrainian side.
hard. I'm sure it's very hard. And both sides have an interest in one playing up, how many casualties the other side has sustained while diminishing their own reporting of casualties. But for the Ukrainians, there's a careful line to draw in that if it looks like you're not suffering at all, then that brings into question Western support. And so that's kind of a dangerous game to play. But I think at this point in the war, I mean, I think it was more prevalent in the beginning of the war. The kind of either inflating your adversary's losses and deflating your own. I think at this point in the war, everybody understands that both sides have the human cost in this has been tremendous.
There were a number of statements made by the U.S. officials in the last few days regarding the military developments on the ground. Secretary Blinken stated that Western sanctions against Russia are making Moscow pay an increasingly high price every day and make it more difficult to resupply weapons to continue the war in Ukraine. You recently co-authored a report where it suggests that Russian capabilities are far from being completely depleted. Can you explain the situation, the reality of that, and how this assessment work in general?
Well, so I mean, the sanctions are working longer term. I don't. You'll see reports about going after Putin's war chest or putting sanctions on the development of missiles. I think the sanctions are most important, especially sanctions on things like microelectronics. I think that's going to have a pretty big impact down the road. I don't know that it's having an impact on the battlefield right now. Right, I think the Russians have some capability of continuing to produce munitions, not very quickly and not of a very sophisticated manner. But there's a delay between, especially economic sanctions. There's a big delay there, and even with the sanctions against things like microelectronics, there are ways to get around that. We've looked at weapons that you find on the battlefield, and it's kind of a mixture of Western and homemade stuff. So there's still some innovation happening there to try to keep systems on the field, but this definitely has an impact, going forward.
In the report I mentioned, you wrote Russia has a history of insulating defense spending from economic downturn. How does it work in general? How can we understand this?
Well, I mean, typically the Russian leadership will pull back on expending funds on social systems, healthcare, things of that nature, subsidies, whatever you choose, in order to isolate defense spending, and they'll hedge against that in the future. We've seen that even during peacetime, when the economic situation gets a little worse. They typically will protect defense spending. That doesn't mean they don't adjust it, or sometimes lower it, raise it, calibrate it, however you want to think about it. But definitely during a time like this, they're going to look to isolate defense spending so that they can stay in the fight.
The head of the U.S. National Intelligence Agency, Heinz, suggested that it's only now that Vladimir Putin is starting to understand the scope of the issues and challenges that Russia is facing in this war. Is it going to alter his strategy in any way, you think? And first of all, do you agree with the statement?
I don't think at this point it's going to alter his strategy. I agree with Haynes in that it's hard to keep the level of loss away from Putin. I mean, he's got to know at this point that it's been pretty bad. But I think that in general, the Russian leadership believes that Russia can regroup and sustain itself, bring in new recruits, take a different tactic, and really make gains either in the winter or after the winter. I mean, the Russians I've spoken to will say that maybe a counteroffensive comes in the spring or summer, and that would give the Russians some time to try to integrate the mobilization efforts. They might have a follow-on mobilization effort. So I think the Russian leadership is, while they understand they've made some pretty big mistakes, I think they're still confident that they can achieve many of their goals in Ukraine.
From what you see, from what you know, Jeff, should we expect another big wave of mobilization in Russia?
I do. I think you will see that. I think, we've, at least a number of my colleagues and some other Russians I've spoken to have definitely anticipated multiple waves of mobilization. I think that's definitely the case, given that a lot of what I've heard is a surprise that there was not more political backlash in Russia against the mobilization. And so the Russian leadership, assesses that, well, okay, this wasn't as unpopular as we thought, and that certainly encourages them to bring up additional, mobilization waves. And the Russian military certainly needs it because they have a serious manpower problem, and so they have to address that. I think they're waiting to see what the current mobilization program has done, but I think even during the initial mobilization, they had already planned for multiple mobilizations.
Jeff, you mentioned winter, and everybody's keeping an eye on winter conditions settling in on the battlefield. How is it supposed to alter the dynamics of the fight, and what do you expect in that sense? And will winter be more kind of advantageous for any of the sides of the conflict?
So winter makes war hard. It doesn't make war stop, right? And so just at the individual level, it's just hard to get up in the morning when you're cold or you've been up all night. You're in horrible living conditions. It's harder to motivate yourself to maintain your tank or your weapons, or to just not hunker down and try to stay warm. And so just everything from the individual level all the way up to larger units, everything just becomes harder. That doesn't mean things stop though. And so I think right now there's a lot of anecdotal evidence anyway to suggest that the Russians aren't very well supplied for winter, which is kind of surprising, I think. Again, that's anecdotal evidence. It's hard to have I don't have a complete survey of what all of the Russians have as far as winter gear goes. I do know that we and the Canadians and others are supplying the Ukrainians with high-end winter gear, right? And so in some ways, I think given the low morale that the Russian military has had going into winter, if they have a lack of good winter gear, I think that there's more advantage to the Ukrainians. And it wouldn't surprise me if we saw the Ukrainians continuing to conduct offensive operations into winter.
When we're talking about the Bakhmut offensive, Russia seems to be concentrating on that direction and on capturing Bakhmut. Does it have any meaning in the big picture of the battle?
I think there's a couple different drivers behind that. One is, there's a lot of the Wagner group there and other groups. In part, I think this is like to show that they can actually accomplish something, but also there's military significance to the area as far as logistic hubs and things of that nature go. And it's an area where they've had some promise. And I think there's definitely, I would argue there's kind of a psychological component to this, in that someone needs to produce some positive results, right? And if that's the area where you can do it, then you do it there. Bakhmut has been fought over for, in any war involving this area. Bakhmut's an area where you can concentrate. And I think a lot of that has to do with logistics, but also I think there's this aspect of just really trying to get something done from the Russian side, getting some kind of positive gains.
Yeah, coming back to the possibility of this change in outlook of the Russian leadership, possibly change of the strategy. In your report, you're right. Russia's sense of vulnerability, given the degradation of its conventional capabilities, will lead Moscow to double down on the development of its nuclear forces, especially theater nuclear forces. Does it mean that the limited nuclear war scenario is still on the table for Ukraine, and we can just, remember last week's Minister Lavrov statement that the risk of any non-nuclear escalation turning nuclear is very high now?
So I think the report we're talking more about Russia's general stance, right? There's always this calculation that people make. Well, if you have nuclear weapons and you have weak conventional forces, you rely more on your nuclear weapons. The stronger your conventional forces come, the less you rely on nuclear weapons. I think that's an oversimplification, but that's some of the logic there. So that report is saying, like, in general, going forward, given the cost of this war, Russia will likely rely more on nuclear coercion than many thought it was moving to, right? A lot of people thought that before the war, growing Russian conventional capabilities would mean less reliance on nuclear coercion. We're kind of saying, well, that's not the case now. Now, for the case for nuclear use in Ukraine, that is still on the table, in my opinion. But I think that there are a number of steps that can be taken that the Russians could take before reaching that point. You could do things like hit, an arms depot in Poland. There's all kinds of other capabilities they haven't used, anti-satellite, this from the outside. We have no knowledge in, like, using anti-space type of things that tools that they could draw from to escalate the situation. And so I think there are other things they can do before they get to non-strategic nuclear weapons. I think that if you do those, see the Russians losing big in Ukraine, I think that the more that happens, the higher the probability of non-strategic nuclear use.
It was those strikes, drone strikes, what you started with, we started our conversation with. Do you think the military leadership and maybe Vladimir Putin will feel that it's about time to just show the real force and since the Russian territory is now attacked, to step up this game?
Well, perhaps, but it's difficult to see how they would do that, right? So they're already hitting critical infrastructure. They can't do anything with their military that they're not already doing. So they can step up strikes again, but I mean they've been doing that for a while. So it's not clear that they could, outside of these other escalatory steps that I mentioned, outside of that, it doesn't seem like there's a big qualitative change that they could make to suddenly change everything. They can't suddenly take territory, or they can't suddenly increase missile strikes, qualitatively more than they have. In a sense of it being a different kind of game, right? Or a different kind of military action. I think all they can do is continue to do what they're doing, attacking critical infrastructure, going after the Ukrainian will to fight, which I think is not working, and then holding the territory they have.
Yeah, in terms of the calculus on the American side, are there any predictions, expectations as to how long this war might continue for?
There are a lot. You hear a lot of different assessments, right? If the Russians can stay in the fight and continue to supply and sustain their troops, if the Ukrainians continue to get Western support and do as well as they're doing, you could see this last. People talk about years, maybe. I personally am just focused on winter, right? This winter is going to be pretty critical for both forces. I think a lot of things could change, and I think it's very difficult to say how long this lasts. But it wouldn't surprise me if this settles into. It wouldn't surprise me if the Ukrainians make additional gains, but it also wouldn't surprise me if the Russians are able to hold on to some territory. And so then you have this kind of. It's not even an armistice. It's kind of, and it's not a frozen conflict. It's this disputed line of contact where you have occasional flare-ups of intense violence as one side thinks that they can take territory from the other. That might be a scenario we move into. We're not there yet. Again, I think winter is pretty critical, and it'll be important to see how both forces last through winter, and then what position are they in when they come out of winter. The Ukrainians going to feel like they're able to go even more on the offensive. Do the Russians think they can counterattack? That's what I'm looking at.
So the Russian side is trying to bring together the National Security Council one more time, and they're going to argue that the military supplies from the West are just contributing to prolonging this conflict of Russia and Ukraine. And we've been hearing different reports from France about the lack of ammunition that they can, at this point, be given to Ukraine because the national security of France is going to be in danger at this point. And there are different voices regarding that. How long do you think this is a sustainable endeavor to be giving arms to Ukraine with this tempo and speed that we've been seeing so far?
I mean, I do think the Ukrainians are going through ammunition faster than anyone can supply them, and so are the Russians. And so that becomes a real critical concern going forward. I know that we have suddenly ramped up our production of various types of munitions. Those announcements have been just within the last couple of days. There's going to be some lag, and it depends on how much of that we want to actually give to the Ukrainians and how much we want to reserve for ourselves. And each European country has to make a similar decision there. But the ammunition issue is going to be important for both sides.
So basically, what are obviously for Ukraine, the ways to replenish is to get it from the West. What are the ways and channels for Russia?
Well, the Russians have to try to, they've gone to, I believe they've gone to North Korea. I don't think China has given them anything. They've gotten drones from Iran. So they're trying to get capabilities from, their partners and allies. And then their own domestic production. I think I've heard that they're working shifts around the clock to try to produce these things. But the bottom line is currently, neither side has, both sides are using ammunition faster than they can get it. And so at a certain point, there got to be decisions made that becomes critical. And so I think that'll be one of the most important factors going forward.